mention his lecture this evening is the first of a series of public events this week. It's a part of what we call the Candidates Week in the Design Research Lab, the graduate design program. Each year at this time of year we invite the Phase 2 students back to the school to present their independent thesis design projects in an open jury that's held in the lecture hall here. And we'll be doing that tomorrow and Wednesday all day, starting at about 10 o'clock until 3. And in inviting the students, we select a group of critics and invite them to come to the A and spend a few days. This year, in addition to Raoul, we're joined by Bob Somo from Los Angeles, Jesse Reiser from New York, and Alex DeRijke from London. And you'll get a chance to know each of them. Bob will be giving a lecture tomorrow night, Jesse on Wednesday night. Alex, you know, because of his lecture last spring here in the hall. We want to, of course, invite you both to the lectures in the next couple of nights and the presentations on Tuesday and Wednesday. This year, in addition to the candidates' presentations, we've also invited the critics to lead an urbanism workshop that we started last Friday. It'll be going for 2 weeks and be presented in this hall on Thursday and Friday, the 5th and 6th of February, which we want to invite you all to also. I think most of you will know Raoul Bunschoten from his teaching here at the school. Raoul taught about 11 years continuously at the A, starting in the early 80s, as Diploma Unit Master at Diploma Unit 2 here at the AA. He's a Dutch architect, studied at the ETH, and also at Cranbrook Academy of Art and the Cooper Union in the United States. He is the founding director of an institute called Chora that's headquartered here in London. It's a kind of combination office, laboratory, research institute that's attracting right now postgraduate students to come and spend time researching conditions in the city. He has a number of affiliations between that institution and other schools, including MIT in the States and ETH, and is interested in establishing both institutional links between this kind of independent laboratory and pursuing a range of activities within the laboratory itself. It's a combination research facility and actual laboratory modeling and materials workshop that produces prototypes for urban projects within the city. I think most of you will know his work from, especially I think the pieces published in A Files in the 1980s and the 1990s. In 1985, Spinoza's Garden was published, one of his early kind of pieces that was part of the Biennale in Holland. And a few years later, in 1990, a project called Skin of the Earth. And I think in the early work, it was, I think, especially the kind of laboratory modeling aspect of the materials research aspect of the work was stressed, which placed a kind of emphasis on installation work and the possibility of making pieces that could be exhibited between different settings. In the last few years, Chora especially has begun to focus on the question of urban, both urban planning and design, but I think especially, and this is the really interesting thing, the question of urban policy in really the contemporary European city, which in the last few years has started to return again to the kind of discourse in architecture. I think after several years with a kind of fascination in the Far East and cities that were undergoing a very different kind of history than the European capitals, the kind of research Raoul's been heading as a part of Chora has started to focus increasingly on the question of the urban city, the European city, and the role that the architect can play in helping to shape not just designs or projects, but the question of policy itself. And I think especially in a place like London right now, where the question of policy has almost disappeared from larger discussions, it's a real contribution that he's imagining the architect can make to that kind of work. Please join me in welcoming Raoul Bunschoten.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me like this. Yes. Okay, I want to a few words. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me. It's actually a great pleasure to be here again. I spent many years in this building, and I think it has formed very much the work that I will show tonight. There's a direct relationship between the I could say the testing, the experimentation that we've been doing over the years in this school, and now that testing is I would say is going out in perhaps in more complex environments. But there's a very direct relationship to what was possible here, I would say, and what we're doing now. I mean, the whole Institute of Chora, which is really a laboratory, it's not really an educational institution. It's built up partly with former AA students, the Corashino, Peter Hastel, and recently we're joined by other people. And well, the basic block of Chora work I want to show you is actually based directly on a kind of a structure of work which we were developing in Diploma 2 during I should say the last few years, sort of kind of beginning of the 90s. So it comes directly from that period. I will show two sets of work. One is more urban oriented, and the other one is more, I would say, directly site oriented. I would like to give you a brief sketch of what we're doing right now. We are trying to become a kind of, you could say, kind of a policy institute, but also to see if we can get commissioned studies. That is already happening partly. At the same time, we're setting up self-initiated studies. One of them is going to be in London. We're trying to set up a self-initiated planning study in London in the light and in the context of the political changes that are going on in London. Hopefully, probably, I would say, and maybe to be precise about that, I would say we're interested in making the kind of project which necessitates these kind of political changes in a big city. So instead of saying, well, what can we do in the site, we would like to say, how can a site can help us to demonstrate a certain kind of project which in fact necessitates reformation or other kind of political change. We are doing several publications right now. One I had hoped to show here tonight, but because I actually told you till the school too late, the first thing that will be published is a small book with a CD-ROM animation. Black Dog will publish it soon. It's called Metaspaces, and this is kind of a brief introduction to I could say the methodology that we are setting up, the method we're kind of developing slowly in order to understand urban change. Now, this concept of urban change is the main concept underlying the book that we are publishing by Chora. It will be published by 010 in the Netherlands in the next few months, and that's a book called Urban Flotsam that actually sets out the basic outline of the methodology of Chora, which is really about how to understand, how to see urban change, how to understand urban change, and how to act in urban change. It's very simple, of course. Reality is not that simple, and I'll show you some things. But how do we understand radical change, as you could say, and how can you begin to act in an environment where you cannot act in a simple master plan way. I will intersperse the whole lecture with some personal observations. I have some favorite pieces that I always show in every lecture, that I will show here as well. And they're in a way to kind of interpret the mechanisms that we're using. And then there's other work, I would say. There's the history of model work that Bert already mentioned, and more recent competition work. All that is part of another book that is coming out by another publisher in the Netherlands. The fourth book, just to top it up, I just worked on is about a big demonstration workshop I did in Denmark. I'll show a bit of that. I'm doing now several workshops to in a way test out and demonstrate the methods in an urban environment with as many people as possible. And in Denmark this involved 240 people, roughly, one workshop. So the first part of my lecture I will show. I have roughly structured in the in the way that the book, the Chora book, is structured, it has four main chapters. It's quite strict in its setup. Every chapter has one piece of methodology and a case study. Now, I don't have pictures of the mock-up here, but I've roughly organized the work that I want to show in terms of these four chapters. The 4 chapters are called Proto-Urban Conditions, Dynamic Modeling, Taxonomy and Unfolding, and Liminal Bodies. And I will try to, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about theory, it would just become much too long. I would like to take you at a fair speed through test projects. Some of them are just workshops, some of them teaching, some of them are commissioned studies, to give you a glimpse. I cannot spell out all the works, so excuse me if I will simply go fast, and then at least I think you can get an overview. That was my intention of tonight. The basic condition of proto-urban, the basic issue of proto-urban conditions is that it's a concept that we developed here. It's a name for those things that underlie urban change, but are invisible. They're in a way submerged. And I will start to talk about that directly. Maybe we can start with the first slide. And then okay, the kind of center project, which I don't show tonight, the Skin of the Earth, a project, a model, you could say, a large-scale model set up in Moscow in 1990, which was about the dissolution of the skin of the Earth in a series of domestic fragments. It was also about the dissolution of the Soviet Union into a series of smaller parts. That was a piece that demonstrated my interest in the skin of the Earth as, in a way, you could say, a prime condition of architecture. And the basic concept of the Chora work, you could say, is that you have the skin of the Earth in which we live, and which we also model architecturally in order to give expression to our our way of living, our sense of order. And there is metaphorically speaking, a second skin of the Earth, which is the urban city. Or the global city, simply everything that's urban, which I think is a kind of total form right now, which in some way is affected by the first skin of the Earth. It mimics to some degree the first skin of the Earth, but it's also affected by it. There's a very kind of complex set of dynamic relationships between the second skin and the first skin of the Earth. So these are simply images of the skin of the Earth, but in this case, the atmospheric skin of the Earth, the weather, which is of course a very important metaphor or model, I could say, for the way that I consider the city to be, which is, you can only see it as a dynamic condition. So the way we study cities are only conditions of change. In other words, everything moves, and you have to look at patterns of change. These are simply odd moments at any time. Now, how to find out which of these movements, these motions, these conditions are in fact not visible? These are visible. These are from a satellite shot. And how to find out how they manifest themselves? Let's say there are large-scale conditions that stir the city, hence the title "Stirring the City." How can we find out how these are manifested in a fragmented way? Now, I want to jump to another model for a moment. A very important one, I find. It's the first of a series of icon images which come from my private interest I have. I just want to briefly go through it. It's of course, it comes from early Christianity. In fact, it's a Russian icon in this case, based on Byzantine models earlier on. Doesn't matter which religion, but what's important in this case, it's a mother, there's a child, and she holds the child to her face. So you get this kind of shape coming together. Now, she looks away from the child, and of course we know the story. This child is Christ, and we know what's going to happen to him, and the mother apparently sees in the future, sees what's going to happen. Now, this was something that the painter wanted to express here. All painters that painted this image, there are thousands of these images, and they're exactly the same. And he or she, but I presume in this case was a he who painted this icon, made, and it was an agreement, made something that was quite important. He painted the edge of her cloth in such a way, and it's always the same way, that it's both a representation of the edge of the cloth, enclosing the space of the mother's face and the child's face, and at the same time being a zigzag, something we like a lot, often. Zigzag, of course, being an emblem of agitation. And this zigzag became an iconic element that's always repeated, which in the pictorial space is merely the edge of her cloth, and on the picture plane is a sign of agony, a sign of agitation. And the question, in a way we are putting ourselves is, how can we find these signs in urban environments? How can we find this kind of, well, it doesn't have to be a zigzag, but this kind of signs of any kind of commotion inscribed in urban environment, providing we don't see the full picture. I want to have a very basic example of urban chains, just to kind of set, it's like a small frame. A case study that always interested me, we worked on that during my own student years in the ETH and under Paul Hofer, professor of urbanism there, and we went there to study the chains of the Roman castrum, which is here. If you look at this square here, you just see the outlines of the Roman castrum, of the change of that very ordered geometrical grid into a very loosely organized curvilinear pattern. And I give you a bit of a cartoon explanation of it, very simple, but still there's a complex history of a foundation of monasteries on the edge of this Roman castrum here. And I find it very beautiful to imagine that over 1,000 years, the building and rebuilding of the city actually gives us an image of plasticity of a city. Literally, the streets started to curve away and move towards these monasteries. Simply by extending the time scale, this city acts like the weather. It's fluid and plastic, and it has attractors that create a form and a pattern. This is one of those monasteries, of course, a later rebuilding, part of the famous Baroque of Lecce school, but it's one of the sites, one of the attractors in that place. So, and here you see one of the curvilinear streets, but behind the walls, all the foundations and the interior walls are all geometric, orthogonal to each other. They're very rigidly repeating the Roman grid. This is just a small sidestep, but I won't show you further historical examples, but I have a great interest in kind of always feeding back new methods into finding them back into older case studies. Good. Now, the CD-ROM that I cannot show you right now shows a bit of technology we are used to model chains. And I just show you two images of the CD-ROM. I sort of thought I was going to have the CD-ROM. And this image, this shows in a way what we are trying to do. We're trying to say, look, this is the skin of the earth. Now, somehow these proto-urban conditions that stir the city are submerged. Of course, that's just a model, but they're not necessarily under the ground. That's more an echo of geologic conditions. But how can we find a model how can we construct a model which in a way reads these stirrings? Now that model is something we developed originally here in the EA, and it's a model which states that we only look at processes, we look at conditions of change, and in fact we made a basic set of 4 processes, and those processes we have now been using over and over and over again in many places and workshops, and they're slowly beginning to get settled. Now the CD-ROM introduces those four processes: the erasure, origination, transformation, and migration. And in the CD-ROM, we explain them, we animate those processes in a very simple way. So the CD-ROM consists out of those processes animated, and it has another animation, a very crude animation, not CAD at all. It's literally animating Czech style. It's like surreal animation. I regret I cannot show it. It's very funny. Anyway, but we're trying to show again in this model, this is the horizon, the proto-urban conditions, which here are blown up common objects, simply sectioned and blown up, and they appear just above the surface of the Earth, become the world as we know it. The numbers connote these proto-urban conditions, and the letters, in effect, connote things that emerge out of conflicts between proto-urban conditions, namely what we call liminal bodies. I'll talk about that a bit later. So those A. Everything would move in animation. Everything moves around and along this horizon. So what I will show you in the next few projects is the testing of these four processes, but also I will show you a bit how the dynamic modeling is intended to look for this kind of submerged stuff, the stuff that we kind of don't see, but with which we would like to work. The idea being that any interventions we're making in the urban environment is using the kind of energy of these larger proto-urban conditions, and that's based on the concept that as an architect in a city, you have never full control, so you have to somehow ride on forces or conditions that are already going on. First, you can change them. So. Okay, a few more introductory images of different schools. I've been now setting up this model in large. This was in the Berlage Institute, where we this is a big cube, like in the animation, where we try to animate the field, the surface of urban conditions with bodies. These are some of the students of the Berlage Institute. And here you see them reaching the horizon, which is a steel beam around the grid that's stretched across the... later on in the lecture, I'll show you the theoretical model that this is based on, but that comes only after the urban projects. So the rules are very strict. You can move, and there were some stages, but it was very strict about showing no scale below the horizon and a very precise scale above the horizon. Suddenly it becomes the known world. Started design. And the first configuration appear above the skin of the Earth, which here is very abstract. It's not actually the landscape we know, but it's a purely abstract geometric configuration. Now then, recently we had an exhibition in the storefront for art and architecture in New York City, and there we showed the content of the book to come, and there we built a large-scale model. It's about 3 meters high, 3 meters cube. With, again, we stretched the grids in there. In this case, we actually built a still model. It's not animated, thank you, of the proto-urban conditions. It's very plastic, very crude, but that's one thing I really want to pursue. Of the proto-urban conditions just meeting the surface, the cartographic surface of the Earth, and then becoming the world as we know it above it. Here's some photographs that Elaine made in New York. We tried to animate it also with a video, but that's not yet. Later on, I'll show in the theoretical model how, again, the whole thing is set up in a very basic, very silly, simple game of objects that have anchors that move around according to a set of simple rules in this grid. The simplest way that you can model a dynamic environment. And what's nice about this cube is that it has this sort of upside-down landscape inside it. So these pictures by Ellen Binet will be also in the book that sits around the CD-ROM. kind of very primal architecture. All done with common objects. Okay, now something we have partly published already, but it will be published more extensively in the book. I'm now in a way in the first chapter called Proto-Urban Conditions. It's a study project we did in Alexandrov, a smaller city in Russia, just after the changes. And this is, of course, it's just an image, but it's the first time that there was civil unrest and this kind of commotion in the streets of Moscow. This is Moscow, not yet Alexandrov. But in a way, I often show this picture after that of the icon of the woman, because suddenly this agitation comes straight onto the street. And into the city of Alexandrov, I just show you a few small images. This was a cooling house, just one detail of this city study. A cooling house for the last 80 years. Of course, it originally was a Byzantine church, and now it's becoming a church again. So inside you find a very thin paper wall with iconostasis, which is those kind of icons that I show in the beginning that I'll show later. Just one of the kind of the moments of change in the city of Russia. Now there we did extensive field work with the authorities. This is the chief architect of the city of Alexandrov. He is the interpreter of the what's called the Institute for Urban Studies in Moscow that was working with us, Takuro Shino, myself. And we actually spent a week long with him and the people that are working with him, simply looking for conditions of change. What is changes? Why is it changing? How is it changing? How can you measure those changes? How can you put handles to those changes? And who's involved? What are the actors and agents involved in these changes? The problem is that he simply has no control whatsoever. No laws apply anymore, no rules, no regulations. He simply has to make decisions day by day. And so we were trying to look at pressure zones. First of all, we tried to look at networks in the city. This was still in the period we were working here in the AA. There were students of DIP 2 then and DIP 10 also involved in it. We were looking at networks of people, so it looked very quickly at the different clusters of communities and groups of actors and agents in this city, which was completely raw in its changes. Here's a more detailed shot of it. So instead of saying, well, we're making a very thorough scientific study, we actually move very quickly through the town in different levels. And then basically we try to end up, here's one of the students of DIP 10 working with younger people in the cities. It had a lot to do with infiltration. We're trying to develop techniques of field work, which are very much about also slowly moving in with people, trying to understand how they live in these changes or are partly active in them. So field work is becoming, in a way, an art in itself, but we're trying to systematize it with these 4 processes. And this first chapter is very much about field work. And one of the things we try to look at, and this was published in AD at some point, is our conditions of public space. Public means, in a way, simply empty, not just built over space, very raw space, on the peripheries of the city, sometimes in the middle of the city. And we're trying to look at what are the pressures on these open spaces. And pressures are in this case represented very crudely by the different letters that represent actors and agents having desires on these leftover spaces on the peripheries. And we try to work with the authorities about policy, what to do. How can you kind of at least hold off until you are sure that you can guide a certain concept forward. Now to jump from that towards the workshop, and I just came from Denmark doing the book on this project. I'll show you a few glimpses on this. This was very funny, and this is workshop in Aarhus, School of Architecture there. And I introduced the bean method there. It's a method to introduce, on the one hand, a condition of randomness in the field work, how to not see the things that you want to see, how to find random sites, and how to then become very systematic in those random sites. It was a workshop with 200 people and then staff. And those people were divided in groups of 4, each representing one of the 4 processes. I'll talk about it a bit later. And so we had 44 groups, 44 teams, so we decided for 44 sites in the city. And we made a city game board, threw the beans, and we had 44 sites. The game board is a kind of cutout of the city. It's a very careful cutout. It sort of represents as much as possible city center, the sea, the harbor, green fields outside, periphery, and so on. Mark the spots very precisely. And we made a larger game board. And here you see the 200 students. And then what happened was that I asked them to also, this goes back to this material modeling that Brett talked about. First I asked them to do an exercise which was to change the common object. And then to take one process, each student was representative of one process, and to look at the change of that object in terms of his or her one process, in order to learn that and become a specialist on that. Then I set up unions. I set up 4 unions, big political unions, representing each one of the processes. And we had 2 layers of meetings. We had meetings of the groups of 4, and we had meetings of the groups of the unions, where we kind of worked through historical analysis of conditions of the 4 processes. And then there was a case of kind of going out on the site doing field work. They had to write scenarios. At the same time, we had a kind of a case of instant architecture. We colonized this map with the objects. So here, the 44 sites. And I have to tell you about why. Well, if you create a random nest like this, crude randomness nest, right? It's just throwing beans. And you have 44. You're pretty sure that you get a good range of that you touch a good range of conditions that exist in the city. And this is what's the beauty about it, without you choosing it. So, colonization of the map. The first negotiation took place by 4 students suddenly being forced to colonize one point in the city with 4 different objects. And you got a lot of the kind of diagrams here. You just see one of them. I mean, this is not actually very analytical, but it's simply condition of change of one object. Very simple, but what happens if you put the 4 processes over that? What do you erase and so on? Colonization of the map, crude but instant. But I like all these kind of crude echoes. For example, the notation of the map, objects, manipulation of the object. The kind of plasticity of an object, it always helps you to read a site as well. This is obviously out in the field somewhere. Then site meetings with all teams in all sites. One of the bean sites was right here, this point. And so here you see a group of 4, and I visited them. I met each group. It was a quite monstrous endeavor. And then what we did is ask them, okay, I did an exercise through the 4 processes, read the site. There's 2 things then happening. I'm kind of going quite quickly through it. One is the question about a mini scenario. What do you see in the site in terms of phenomena of change, and can you classify it in terms of the 4 processes? I'll show you a few later on. The second one is then write a scenario in which you manipulate the 4 processes. You push them. You push change. So I'll just show you one. It's the product's varied, but it doesn't matter. There's now a book coming out with all the 44 sites, a bit of the methodology, and certainly there's an enormous overview of the city. I'll just show you one. This is a ship, one of these fast new ships called the Catlink. It goes from Aarhus to Copenhagen, changing the whole geography of Denmark. It actually warps the geography. But of course, look at this white spot here. It's a 3 or 4 meter high wave, which in 15 minutes is here, hitting the coast. Now, they were actually working on a spot on the coast, at the bean site just on the coast, and they looked at the dynamics of this wave. I'm not particularly keen on the graphics of this, but it was a fast workshop, so I'll just show it to you, because it was an analysis of the dynamics of the crashing of the wave on this coast structured in 4 layers, with the 4 processes, which then in a way maps out, through which you can in a way read the dynamic changes of Denmark as a whole, at least in its changing infrastructure, and so on. So this is one of 44 efforts. There was a few more material on it. What I like about this one is the relationship between very small, minute changes and what we can read in them about larger conditions that force change. There is a big political debate right now going on in Denmark about the destruction caused by these waves in the lower lying islands. It's a big issue. So, you know, in its banality, you suddenly, very quickly, you kind of get into very tough and difficult issues. This is just one more. Here you see that now they have built a bridge, so there's a huge fight going on between the Cat Link and the new bridge, which takes 7 minutes to get across to Copenhagen. And there's a big ecological issue about these waves destroying the agriculture and the fishing of these smaller islands. Just one example. Another example is more complex. Their bean site fell just in the front of this factory, the biggest factory of the city, the soya factory, which imports soya from all over the world. And this is a kind of a later stage of a scenario that has evolved, and they got very involved in the expansion of this factory in the harbor of the city, and they got involved in the whole question of the global market of soybeans and the financial markets influencing the shipping trade of soybeans. So it gets very involved very quickly after its initial banality. He does some more, has to do with social unrest and salaries and so on. Then there's 44 of those, so it's very involved, and right now we are trying to make the whole book in a kind of almost encyclopedic taxonomy of anyway all issues that are going on in the city that are stirred, that you can stir. Then, to lighten that up a bit, because this gets very heavy, there was a second stage of modeling, of instant modeling, where those common objects were wrapped and put back on their sites. And I'll just show you a few images. Doesn't mean anything. But it was important, these were actually second-year students. It was also important for them to realize you don't have to be afraid of the city. You can imagine anything. In the book, they actually slightly manipulated this material. Turned out to become a very strange, surreal garden, in a way. Okay, very briefly, I want to show you how this suddenly begins to spread. We were invited by the Deutsche Bund of Architekten to cooperate in a small professional workshop. Yeah, please, can you make it sharp? It's a terrible slides, but I really wanted to show you because suddenly this becomes the Boden method in Germany, and the professional circles now, but this is Köln or Cologne, and this is Bonn. And suddenly we were in debate with the urban planners of this region, who were actually very fascinated by our method, because we managed, with a team of helpers, to touch on an incredible amount of issues very fast, very quickly. The problem being here, there's no planning for this area. It's full of big industries, agriculture, beautiful landscape, and so on. And also there's a lot of municipalities. And like in other places where we have worked, these people don't actually speak to each other. So how can you touch on issues that are small, banal, but also very complex, and that actually can allow you to orchestrate change in this area? So we did a series of scenarios in which we did field work on site, and then we developed a series of very simple scenarios. These are absolutely absolutely rudimentary, but again, let me just read this one here. It's in German. This is erasure, origination, transformation, migration. And this is about garbage, which is put out in the street. Sperrmüll wird von polnischen Organisationen zum Weiterverkauf abgeholt. Polish people driving their cars, coming across and taking this away. Taking all the garbage on one day, and you have the big garbage, taking it away. Suddenly it touches a kind of black economy of garbage transport. Of course, origination is the moment when you decide you don't want to use anymore your piece of rubbish. And the transformation is about how you get a transformation from that has become rubbish into a trade object, something that has commercial value. And then, of course, the migration it travels to Poland, right? It enters the market there. Incredibly banal, yet incredibly broad, certainly, in its consequences. Of course, then there were lots of other things where we got involved in the larger issue of caretakers for the whole region. We started to look at all the institutions and factors and who could actually begin to kind of create identities for zones. But that is another story, and those are scenarios that are more complex, that are still going on. Now, I want to step further. I want to show you the issue of dynamic modeling. Again, in the same kind of broad and sketchy way. We are struggling with this concept of dynamic modeling. We're trying to give form to it. I have to warn you, this book is still, it's an outline, nothing more. I think it's going to take some years to develop all this. How to model dynamic change and how to give the model the same properties of, the same dynamic properties of the dynamics of the site that's going on. And so that you also, if you have a model, that the model itself evolves, and it kind of evolves along with the evolution of a site. I want to show you two images. This is simply just any kind of image of a book about the dynamics of the geology. This is about modeling dynamic change of the interaction between water and sand. And this is another project by an English artist, Goldsworthy, and he did something very beautiful. He took ice from the hills in Scotland, some hills in Scotland, and he, in a way, creates paintings that are mapping the dynamic change. So the ice has particles of mud of the hill in Scotland, then it melts in his studio, and it becomes this, and it dries. And it actually begins to look like the map, the geological maps we know. Or it even looks, this is another detail of his work. Quite incredible, actually, the way it's just a painting in a way. But these are real particles, I have to tell you. Of course, it looks also like the original hills it comes from. There's all these echoes, these strange kind of echoes that go back and forth. And I've been looking a lot for other cultures that work with models of dynamic operations. These are the Viking knots, a big fascination I have, which is they're kind of emblems of a dynamic environment. The Vikings, they imagined their cosmos to be in flux and in conflict all the time. And they worked with the detail of their ships, the knot, to represent the cosmic image, which they always use everywhere in their churches, and which is emblematic of a dynamic environment. Okay, now I would like you to meet the Locker Girls. The Locker Girls was one bean site again. I'm jumping up in scale a little bit. The Locker Girls were found in the main station of Kyoto. This is Kyoto, where we did a planning study. And they were simply one of the bean sites that happens to fall into this huge place here. There were many other bean sites. And I just want to show them. We took a game board around Kyoto about this big here. And we did field work there with the help of local people and local students of different schools. So the main station here. The main problem, of course, being that the Kyoto population going down, industrial production goes down, a lot of other things decreasing. How do you manage decrease in urban environments? It's one of the problems they're having. Well, we made something like this. Game boards with 60 bean sites. I'll show you just one as an example. Just the Locker Girls. And this was just what we really tried to achieve, the bean sprouts. It has to do with a time scale from 97 to 2097. Yes, 60 bean sites. I'll take one of this now. This is just the index. The Locker Girls. You just read this for a moment. An example of a breakdown of a banal institutionalized event, Locker Girls. Girls are going to school wearing the uniforms through Kyoto Station. After school, they change their clothes from the uniforms and go for shopping together. With the help of a coin and a key, something new happens. A moment in time in which a significant change occurs. They are transformed into young women, girls, out in town. After that time out, they return to the lockers and then take the train home. They leave the scene. The significance is not so much the event itself, but that through its dissection into elementary processes, so again there are the four processes we are using, different sets of influence such as territories, spaces, actors and urban agents can be located and precisely defined. The event maps various urban layers and so on. Now of course this is very funny and of course if you've been to Japan recently you know about it, you know about the socks for example, and what happens is that they set up a new kind of urban space, hybrid space. They effectively occupy the lockers. You can't get close to the lockers at certain times of the day. What is interesting really is that they become a kind of an institution which is informally creating new types of public space. Now, what we are trying to do in this particular project is to look at future actors that become in a way new authorities in the city. If you look over 100 years of a city, you can assume that the authorities that will decide on planning and architecture will radically change. So can we find out who will be the emerging actors and agents? Now the more serious context of this is that at the moment there's very strange things happening in Japan with these girls and these telephones. And men using the telephones, and if you enter an airport or a station in Japan, you will be confronted by monitors telling you about safe sex and the explosion of AIDS statistics in the age group of these girls. So suddenly the whole thing changes. And a city like this, in the light of those kind of changing morals and statistics, needs to be able to talk to these girls. And in a way the proposition is here to kind of out such a scenario, to create a new authority, to actually institutionalize, or at least to recognize people like this as urban actors, and to change the map of urban actors with which you can negotiate and plan, and so on. So this describes this as done more thoroughly, this text. I just want to rush through this text, I think, for a moment. Basically, we were trying to look at how to know polyurban conditions and how to play once you know. That's basically the rough idea. So we actually proposed that the city itself goes through such conditions of field work and then plays out scenarios with these found actors in order to find possible emergent institutions. It's very much an architecture of institution building at the moment. And so how to know, that's the proto-urban level, and then how to play liminal bodies level. I'm jumping ahead in the book right now. And it's in a way, in order to find out how to establish new emerging institutions. Let me just read this text if you can sharpen it here. Okay, to be innovative, a city users, inhabitants and authorities alike must have tools with which to detect newly emerging practices that will evolve as the next generation of authorities. As well, it should invest in stimulating new authorities, urban curators we call it. We talk a lot about curating the city right now, as potential negotiating partners. This assumes that balances of power can shift. Here you see Takuro Shino. We did a lot of field work also with authorities. Again, we're talking about, I don't know. They were not always completely understanding by about, I don't know, 20 municipalities or so. Sorry, something is happening. Yes. We go back to the That was a very fast rerun. Okay, we're almost there. Yeah, and a few more. Let me do it. I'll do it. If I can. Okay, here about. I'm rushing a bit because I really would like to take you through the range of projects. Right. This is just one detail I want to talk about that has emerged a lot from the fieldwork, that we're looking more and more at emerging practices that have shifted around common urban objects. So in a way, you look at a common urban object and you look at how it is being used in a different way. So. Okay. Here we were. I'll just show you quickly again one scenario, and then I want to move to again rubbish this time, by chance. But this was then one scenario about the complex issue of rubbish division, and bringing rubbish back to source. In other words, at the end, the scenario ends with the notion of having to buy your rights to have rubbish, and it ends up here in the. I won't reach you the scenarios, I think. It's going to take too long. But there are four, each scenario is set up in 4 stages. It goes from A to B to C to D, and every time there's a conflict emerging out of a proposition, and additional actors and agents come in and reorganize the situation. It's really cultural planning on a large scale. Second one is to do with bicycles. And the trade of stolen bicycles, which becomes an international issue in Asia, but actually relates very much to the compound. This is the police compound, where they are stored. The police is actually involved in this racket. And because they earn a lot of money, they're now expanding in this site, so it's becoming a very simple architectural issue as well. Here. And another one is, this is again a range of 7, is about the Ogura Lake is actually quite a big issue, and it deals with the ecology and the poisoning or the loss of natural water sources and the need for a new water reservoir. So it actually ends, the scenario ends with the proposition to turn a big piece of land, that's rice fields right now, that used to be some sort of water area, to turn it back into a reservoir. And to create a new water authority, which is also it transgresses the boundaries of the municipalities. So it gets quite involved in ecological issues as well, certainly. It's one of the ranges. And just for a moment to relax, again, just as an image, this is Arshal Gorky, and I think what he did was so fantastic, that he looked at his gardens and slowly plants stop being individual items in space, and they begin to become part of a kind of a continuous and fluid space. And we saw Kyoto a bit like that. So, okay, can we go to the next carousel? I hope I can manage with the timing. I have 2 more urban, I hope you, well, I'll see, I may have to stop. I have 2 more urban projects I want to show, and then I have 3 competitions that follow up this work, Prado Museum and Cardiff, I want to show a bit, and if we still have time, Buenos Aires. But a brief stop for a moment here. The 3rd chapter is called Taxonomy and Unfolding, and it really deals with how to categorize things in urban environments and how to understand how once you categorize them, how they unfold, how you can tell a story about a city. And I believe very strongly in storytelling. And I think more and more in cities where I've been doing work, I think the art of storytelling is very important. It's the only way you can bring very different kind of layers of actors and agents together. And especially where politics is involved, how do you convince people? So again, one of my icons, here's an earlier version. The angel Gabriel meeting Mary, telling her that she will conceive. On one level, a simple story of boy meets girl. But of course, they are different beings, and they cannot actually meet. So what you get is a big tradition of separating out this being from this being. In this case, this is Duccio in the National Gallery here. The perspectival space is continuous, but the pictorial space, the planar space is cut through by a sharp boundary here. And this is, I think, a very profound problem and a profound solution. Very beautiful, but very simple also. And that iconography we've used in one of the projects, I'll show very briefly, the Linz project. Simple iconographic elements that are in a way both embedded, they're embedded diagrams. It's a diagram that's both abstract and it's embedded in the urban environment. And of course then later with Van Eyck, even the angel of Mary are gone. You just have this line in an empty space, the sky from which the angel comes and attributes of Mary. This is usually what you find in the city. You don't really find the protagonist. You just find signs and symbols. So this is a big project, and I just want to say a few words about it. This was a study we did in Linz in Austria, which we called the narrative taxonomy. And we were asked to study the changes that the periphery of the city was undergoing and the problems they were having with planning, giving form to the periphery. The city is marked by one big factory built by the German army during the Second World War, and in a way the steel, the melting of steel became the soul of the city. Just let me say it's like that. And everything still relates to that. The steel factory became the engine of the social democracy of Austria later on. But the problem is you scratch the surface and you get an incredible, difficult Second World War history. We looked at 4 frames. This is the first time we developed this notion of frames, cutting out game boards, which we defined thematically. And this is the first time where we, in a way, switch the 4 processes from being a simultaneous dynamic model towards a narrative taxonomy stretched out, spread out over the geography of a city. So frame 1 is vaguely representing erasure, but now it has become thematic. And in frame 2, origination. Frame 3, this large frame transformation. And the 4th frame is fragmented. And we just looked in fragmented sites. Relates to migration and relates literally to immigrants and policy and so on. The most important thing that I want to tell here is that we laid these frames. They're in a way abstract observation devices, but they have one hinge each, which we called tentatively the fold. Before that word started to burn itself into the white paper, and which is really literally a fold. It somehow looks deep into the history of a site, and they're spaces that are geomorphologically defined or historically defined. Here is the edge of the medieval city, where the medieval city of Linz was facing the river. This edge was the city after that until now. This was the military-industrial complex built by the Germans in the Second World War here. Then the edge of the city of the 50s and the 60s. And the other edges are, in a way, edges in the street where we deal with the problems between non-Austrians and Austrians. And how that they are played out in the street, as it were. The first frame is very much culturally oriented. We deal with cultural events and cultural institutions. The second one very much with the planning of an industrial estate in decline, and this kind of threshold beyond which the city desires to go. The third one deals with the typical sprawl of what's now called the Zwischenstadt, the city that is in a way more city than the old city, but it consists out of 16 municipalities, and it's raw and planned, and it somehow roughly follows the geomorphology of the river landscape. So more and more we're moving into the geology again as well. And the 4th one is fragmented, as I said. A few glimpses of that. Each have a different kind of scale and a different development. And what we're trying to do is both find elements in the frame and find elements on the fold, where it actually tried to effectively design the fold, but with existing elements, and then use existing programs on these elements of the folds to kind of suggest policy for the development of the zones in the frame. I have to really stress that this frame, this is just an abstraction, these lines, but the folds are real. For example, this fold here in the southern part of the city is in fact literally a dip in the land. So there is somehow a kind of a green corridor running through it still. And so we're trying to name the elements of the fold, which in this case are public institutions, all of them. Why? Because in this case the city was built here until 1938. This was the edge of the city, this is the river. And this used to be land flooded over. So this was a gray zone. That's why you have a lot of utilitarian facilities there, or public buildings. Now the big debate was not so much about the detail of the planning and the policy, but more the big debate was to define these folds iconographically, get institutions together as were the players of the game, and set up scenarios with where these different players begin to play. Now I won't go into detail there. This is part of a very brief introduction in this small magazine that the Bartlett brought out. I forgot the name. But this will be in the book in more detail as well. So again, letters and the numbers stand for the same kind of things that I showed in this earlier model. This is Ars Electronica, for example. Big player, big cultural institution sitting there. And here's the second fold with public institutions. And here's this huge industrial zone which is slowly, bit by bit, opening up. It's very difficult to plan anything there because they're just setting off bits of ground in fragments. So what we're actually trying to do is urge the city to symbolically define this fold, at the same time to kind of work together with these different public institutions and in a way have them set an agenda for each of these strips that are defined a bit more precisely in this case here. So that's about the level it stayed. There were discussions whether it would go further. This is the big factory, the center of the big factory, huge, it's effectively a Nazi factory. But very strange inside. This is a building by Peter Behrens, or at least the office of Peter Behrens. Beautiful building, huge glass walls, which is only now becoming visible. Until 2 years ago, you couldn't get in anywhere close. The third one is more geomorphic fold. Runs from a kind of areas that are protected already, other green areas that just happen to create a green corridor. And in this case, in this frame, we talked with all 16 municipalities. Here you see one of the mayors. And we proposed, in fact, a new planning authority for this micro-region, which is, in fact, I think, going to be the future city, in fact. Just one image to show you how very quickly you can link up. This is the city of Linz. This is the area I showed you before. This is one of the kind of the wind corridors that happens to exist, which lies exactly over that fold. And that again links to the political issue of the bad smells of the factory going there and so on. You have to kind of ride on these existing things. Now, again, I'm kind of moving fast through it. I want to show you one next development of these four processes, where it gets even more complex. In the first chapter, where we are looking at liminal bodies, we're trying to look at how we can, in a way, look at these frames as layers that we develop programmatically, and bit by bit, what we are trying to do is create connectivity. We're trying to set up scenarios independently from each other, in time bands, and eventually we're trying to create planning conditions with possible architectural programs connected to them. And I'll show you a few more direct attempts at creating this kind of liminal body in one of these competitions I show. Very different in look, but the same programmatics. And how to allow a new program to emerge. And so this project, it really begins to be about program writing. This was Bucharest. Started with that competition, we just decided then to go autonomous, in which we're trying to look at a much larger geopolitical and geomorphic context still, and that became, in a way, this kind of crude framing for very different conditions became the engine, as it were, the main conditions with which we looked at the center side of Bucharest. Here you see one of the big drives of one of the programs. It's the poisoning of the Black Sea. So we looked at the whole fluvial system of the Black Sea. Why? Because there's only so much you can do in the center of a city that's very destroyed like Bucharest. But, for example, one of the rivers that feeds the Black Sea flows through Bucharest. Now, at the moment, there are global institutions like the International Monetary Funds that puts big amounts of money, make the big amounts of money available for the cleanup of the Black Sea. Now, one of the things we're trying to do is get some of that money and invest that in one of the detailed elements in an urban proposition in Bucharest. There's a kind of the connectivity we like to work with. Of course, the site sits around this huge palace of Ceausescu. We haven't done field work yet. This is a kind of a prototypical project. We will, this fall, do the first layer of field work with the University of Bucharest, and then we're setting up a consortium of various engineering offices and planning offices to actually run the project, but it's still coming. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, the workshop that we just did in Aarhus now is, this summer will be happening in Tokyo, on a Tokyo-wide scale. It's being set up. There will be some places for non-Japanese participants, if anybody's interested to join in August. It's going to be quite an event, based on the same structure. But we're looking very much for interdisciplinary participants also, to really make a big mix. Well, you know the area probably from images and other publications. There was this huge swath. Let me show you the next picture here. Here, let me show it here. This is this big boulevard. This is the big palace. And this is this area, this wound that was cut by Ceausescu in the city. A huge wound of 4 kilometers long. This was published in AD, if you want to look at it more closely. Very briefly, I want to just sketch out how it works. There are 4 programmatic layers, again frames. One is about the toponymy, the renaming of sites. The other one is about the basin, geomorphical conditions of the river. And the third one is about flow, very much about markets and development of new markets and economy. The fourth one is about incorporation, which really has to do with democratic behavior and the link between democratic behavior and city building, especially in East states, very, very important. So these are very crude timelines, and these stones are crude images of what we imagine the interconnectivity between these independent programs to be. So the idea is, and I simplify this enormously, that there are in a way programs written that overlap but are independent, but eventually you get a connectivity. And that's where really new things begin to emerge. So it's not about filling in city planning or city design. It's about really writing programs. So for example, the program for toponymy had to do with just festival culture. And we did a big study of the Notting Hill festival here, exactly how it was set up, who ran it, what's the organization, and so on. And that is a very abstract drawing. This is Hill with Ceausescu's palace here. And there are some very simple reshaping conditions, but most of it is really about a calendar, that's here I think, a calendar of events that simply changes the symbolic nature of that site. This is just simple versions how you, with a series of existing and newly created festivals, actually, you don't have to worry about the shape of this, or the scale of this thing, because cultural identity works on a very different level. Besides, it's so important. The second level is based on the river basin of the river runs through Bucharest, which became a kind of a model for the restoration of very small churches. And these are abstract images, but this is the boulevard here. This is where the palace is. We've been looking at sites of destroyed Orthodox churches that sit just behind the wall of Ceausescu's boulevard, which runs here. and how the numbers relate to small programs restoring churches and writing competitions for new churches. Third program deals with the re-establishment of 2 markets along an axis running through the city, but I actually want to talk only about one issue there, which is this water plant. As part of this line of new economical developments, we're proposing, in effect, a water plant right smack in the center of the boulevard, where the river is put underneath the boulevard by Ceausescu. The water plant, of course, based on new technologies of wetlands, which also allow new, kind of park landscape and new forms of leisure to take place right in the center of this boulevard. Again, financed by the International Monetary Fund and other funds. I'm missing one drawing, but this is the basic position. There's some drawings that show you how it works, but I don't have that here. So it's just a piece of incredible technology, but that relates to this geopolitical scale. And the fourth one is about football clubs. And football clubs being the only kind of surviving community elements in this destroyed area with which you can slowly build up a new awareness and new political institutions with which, first of all, to plan this park. This is this wounds cut into the city by Ceausescu. First of all, to get local communities to help regulate this thing, not building it over, but simply just leaving it open for the time being, allowing for later periods to plan until they become more powerful political entities in about 10 years or something like that. The main problems here is how to hold off development, not how to encourage development. And that's City Park. One detail I want to show you, the first step of this scenario is based on a series of local football clubs and the National Opera, which was not finished. It's 1 meter high. And the plan of the National Opera, commissioned by Ceausescu, has exactly the size and shape of a football field. So the first proposition was we just fill it up and have it right in the center there, one football field, and run that community. Very banal, but then it grows. Yeah, I still want to talk for a few minutes about this. Just very briefly, I did a study in Colombia where I tried out some of these things. Partly worked. One element I want to show here very briefly, which was about the shifting of, again, it's about kind of banality and simplicity. It's about 52 empty or destroyed sites in Harlem, and the use of a dynamic model based on a rock in the river Hudson as a kind of pattern that could be used for dynamic development in these different sites. So here you see the rock, and we did studies of dynamic behavior of that. I didn't show that, I didn't have all the material here. And then you see the shift of that, of the diagrams of the dynamic behavior onto a very complex site in which we would try to work with small clusters of actors and agents that eventually begin to settle, negotiate about these sites and settle them with very simple architectural objects. The ambition was of this team, this was a team of 2 students, to work with almost minimal elements. Here you see almost nothing, hired bits and things and locally produced wall blades to create an architecture that begins nothing but actually you're talking about 52 sites. So in fact, slowly you're stirring a whole area of Harlem. I can't really talk about the program. It had a lot to do with parking and or people that invested from Midtown Manhattan and that worked together with local agents, actors and agents. This kind of minimalism, in a way, I kind of liked, as long as you work with big numbers. So the liminal bodies here always being unlikely combinations of actors and agents, and that's where, in a way, the architect planner would come in to orchestrate that. One more example of liminal bodies that it's a bit more clear, but it's still a large example. These are stitching details from ferrocement that I've been developing over many years, which I'm not showing tonight. And in a way, we're using these stitching patterns right now to look at the more complex conditions of actors and agents negotiating with each other across a line of conflict. And I want to show you one. I'm really running out of time, but I guess I just go on a bit. I did another workshop on the same basis in Taichung, which is a city right here, which is undergoing incredible development. So I did the same method, 4 processes, the lot. But here we used one big model. We said, well, the whole of the Taiwan Strait is in a way a kind of liminal model, a kind of a model of a liminal body. As you know, Taiwan is not a sovereign state in a normal sense. And it's very unclear what it will become. Will it be unified? Will it be totally independent eventually? Is this an internal public space? Is it a border? So we looked at how the crazy changes that are happening in the city actually affected by that kind of public space. We started the workshop on the day that there were the first president's elections ever held in Taiwan. So the situation was incredibly politicized, very highly charged. You know that China was lobbing big rockets at the time just outside the harbors of Taiwan. Typical image of these areas. It's a city that's undergoing incredible growth without any planning at all. And it has very deep cultural historical layers. For example, this is one of Chiang Kai-shek's old soldiers, and which is a kind of a minority of mainland people, now quite old, but actually still being quite important in setting up one very strict and strictly separated layer in that city. And this, just to tell you how crazy this went, this whole thing, by using this method, we very quickly touched on the situation of extreme beauty, I think, a kind of a conflict. They were so enormous that you in a way only could touch them by such a kind of crude method. You know, the main thing about this method is, with these 4 processes, is that it's not derived from the substratum. It's not developed from the place that you're looking at. It's simply projected. That's what's so important, because that way it becomes a comparative model. Because some of the global conditions that are these proto-urban conditions, they are everywhere. They're only manifested in different ways. So this guy, no, this is me. He's just, no, I thought I'd found an image. On this jury, we had 2 people on this jury. One was the national congressman of the district of Taichung. The other one was the most popular, most active senator of Taiwan. Just to tell you, they came to this jury because, in a way, we had 9 conflict sites. One I'm going to show you in a minute. And they wanted to know, actually, well, how can you deal with them? So, very briefly, it's a ridge here. This is the city of Taichung. I mean, you don't see it, but it's actually the city district. This is a harbor, which is another legal district. And this ridge, in a way, was one of the 9 projects we looked at. And the city is growing over towards the harbor is growing towards the city, and we tried to see if we could name this ridge in a very simple way, a hill. Can you name a hill, protecting it from being grown over, in a way to talk about park landscape, although you have big industrial estates entering that. Now, of course, it's not just about park and ecology. It's actually getting actors and agents together, big, powerful decision makers, that actually, by almost luring them around the table on a simple level, the naming of an area, the designating of a parkland, actually putting them together in a new institution that we can begin to plan this much more careful. This is a big threshold now between the city and the harbor. So some steps were made to do that. Now, I want to move from the Taiwan Strait here towards a few images of the original model that we used to get to all of this. There's a project I did years ago, 1988, called Soul Cycle, a series of 27 spheres, made of ferrous cement. And in the project I set myself was to cut out squares, black squares, which we then photographed, and we diagrammatized them. And we asked ourselves, this was then one of the cuts, you can see that published. Here's another detail of that work. So every sphere had a knife and a crossing with 2 wires going over. But in a way we asked ourselves, what happens if you take a square and you assume that you can kind of distill the dynamic conditions in that? And then we got to this very crude game model. In a way, it's the basis of all this work. It will be in the beginning of the book. As a kind of, this is the taxonomy, and this is then a model. It's that game that's the basis of this cube, just a grid with elements that move according to certain rules. And in a way, what we became interested in 1988 to 1989 is the emerging singularities in this moving environment. And it's very simple, but as in Linz you have seen, it becomes very powerful very quickly. So this is, of course, these are already several layers happening simultaneously. I'll give you one simple example to understand this diagram. A kind of brutal example. When the Berlin Wall was built, you had these shifts, right? First the white line, then the wall, which became a perverse piece of architecture, and then gradually you got television, and of course then Western television could be heard in East Berlin. So you get these shifts of the actual boundary moving across. That's in a way that what this diagram is showing. I'll leave this. And then there were some workshops that actually were trying to model the spatial consequences of this model. So I'm just showing this to show you kind of the constant back and forth oscillation between plastic modeling and the urban projects. Now, I would like to end by showing you three competitions that in a way deal with the similar situations, but instead of being about program writing, because all these other projects are really about planning, but very much about programming. And these are more about direct sites, and some of the consequences of what I talked about I try to make happen in these sites through very direct architectural means. And I will show you, in a way, I will show you one of the details of this piece of work, which is still the Soul Cycle. And there are kind of two sources to this. I'm showing you the Prado project. One is one more icon, and the fascination of this cloth, which was apparently given to the temple by Mary. It somehow has something to do with the protection of the city. And I was fascinated by this notion of the city cloth. And the other one is the horizon, and architecture as a way of embodying the horizon. And I just want to show you 3 slides of Mondrian painting this tree, an apple tree, and slowly pulling the horizon forward, merging it with the object, until he gets these clusters of object and horizon being the same thing, really. And ultimately, of course, we get this configuration, and at the end we get just the cross-shaped configurations. In a way, it's kind of living in a horizon, the embodied horizon, which I find very beautiful. And the last reference is Morandi, and he made this incredible series of still lifes, and the edge of the table here looks almost like, in fact, it's the horizon which extends from the objects itself. It's almost like the object is very autonomous, and it extends the horizon outward. Okay, I'll go over the same speed through these 3 projects. The Prado, where is it? It's there, right, here it is. So you probably know about this competition, the extension of it being behind, in this area between the Prado and the 3 new buildings that they wanted, 3 old buildings they wanted to reuse as well. What is important, and that's the only thing I really want to talk about in case of this project, is the word Prado, which means originally soft field, meadow, and this being a hill, goes up, this is a fold, goes up, and this used to be gardens. So the basic project was trying to kind of extend the original idea of the soft field, draping up the gardens back into this area, kind of like revealing a bit of the original skin of the earth. And we're doing that in here. And this was the competition site. Basically, I chose to work in the whole area. And in fact, create a kind of triple public space. One is to connect all cultural institutions together, a new square. Second one is to give this very important church, this kind of symbolically the most important church in Spain, to give it a kind of a new ceremonial public space. And three, to extend more local public space from this Prado building, which is kind of a jewel, backwards from the building. So, most importantly, and related to the materials before, we were interested in a kind of an iconographic link, big fold for pedestrians linking all the institutions. This is the city, and these are the fields going up from the Prado. You see the action of then kind of stretching that skin here and folding it back so that the Prado becomes like a pearl sitting on a very soft, folded piece of skin. And that's the actual project. It's basically just a formation of the land, and all facilities are in here. The new extension is then underneath here, underneath the cloister. Basically, it consists out of a very large piece of skin, warped, folded. There's a point zero. You can actually walk across it. It's a landscape. It becomes, of course, a building with different, very public levels. New entrances here, and these things are caves or crystals of light that penetrate the skin and actually organize the whole interior. And I didn't really put in all the plans here, but effectively here you see the basic section. This is the interior. It's like a public street, served by the new entrances and given light by these crystals of light in here. Here you see the section, new square on the top, extension. This is a kind of a terrace for cafe and restaurant from the Prado underneath here. And this is kind of open space. The new access to the Prado building actually is in from here, from the very large agora space in here. And this is one of the larger crystals that give light to the new extensions in there. You see a diagram, the skin wrapping back and back again underneath a big retaining wall, a knife ineffectively being the wall of this kind of agora sinking down and going up again. Called public floor, or it's the valley in effect. And I left out a lot of plans. I just wanted to show you the basic translation of some of the work. Here you see a very rough model which was only intended to be a mold. In fact, with the crystals of light, main public square for the church, cooler place underneath, possibility to walk down across it. This is just the silhouette of the Prado here. In here is actually, there's a huge space. It's all open, so this light goes down. You have this strange kind of the reverse landscape inside as well. And this is one of the new entrances in the north. You actually get light from here, from the top, going down all the way down the valley inside and going up again. Now, a much older project, but I still put it in here briefly because of course, there's a struggle between these two levels, but I think it's quite important to fight the struggle, to deal with these problems. On the one hand, there's a kind of, you could say, a poetics coming in of this notion of the landscape. Again, here's the notion of the horizon. This is the Cardiff Opera, the Cardiff Bay Opera House. In this case, again, it's a building which comes out of the ground, it has a base, and at the same time, there is a horizon, and above the horizon is a kind of virtual landscape. It's the same idea. But here something else happens. The basic project, and I will explain you one element of it. You notice there was a square, there's the harbor here, and you come down from the city to the square, and then there's a kind of a new grid, a new city being built here. We decided to fill up one triangle, part of the grid. So this is simply street edges, and to make one big cut. That cut becoming very large glass facades, organizing this new square. There was nothing at the time. What I'd like to show here basically is the emergence of the condition of a liminal body in architectural terms. I want to show you one more. By programming two things together. We extended the program. I did a lot of research on the life of contemporary opera music and the types of institutions that need to be built for contemporary music theaters, and we decided to double the program, or not double it, but add a experimental musical theater on top of the opera program. And we tried to work on that architecturally. And the cut here goes through all functions of the opera building, but actually it's just in the middle, underneath the stage tower, which is this. These are the rehearsal spaces. The stage tower, there are huge doors opening up to the square, and the square becomes, in a way, the third stage. I'll just show you that quickly. You see the site plan. You come down from the center of the city down here. This is the big cut through the base. It's the harbor here. And in a way, we were interested in the old locks and the kind of the magic of the sea related to the life of the docks. We translated that into a very rigid program of in a way, thresholds or cuts. The first one between city and opera block with a gate. Then between auditorium and classic opera theater with a gate. And then between the rehearsal room, which became the musical experimentation room, and another gate. And this being opened up eventually in some kind of urban festival, this being the liminal body here. So it's in a way, I have a few more slides left in the last carousel. So in a way, yes, fulfilling the program, but adding something on it which is desperately needs the big program, and creating a new architectural tool out of that, which is, you could say, feeds an art form which we don't know yet. This is in a way what the liminal body is doing. It feeds on conflict, and it creates a new instrument for something we don't know yet. We simply have not the ability yet to completely foresee. But it's there as a device, as a tool to be used. Okay. So here you see the classical opera stage. Again, it's cut by the cut, and then this is the experimental stage, which is part of this main stage. There's doors here. Then this is the situation, oops, upside down. This is the situation where you connect the experimental stage to the classical opera stage and make the link to the square here. Suddenly you have this very strange long body of space. This was in the AA files at some point. Of course, the fascination with natural elements. This is the auditorium being this big stone which comes out above the pneumatic roof, which is translucent. It sort of has traveled and just entered here. This is a series of crude models we made in the time. Another crude sketch model. It consists really out of three parts. A base. These are the three edges. The base is striated like this, as a scene. Then you get this ice flow. It kind of comes up. It's a pneumatic roof. Auditorium coming through, rehearsal rooms and stage tower on top of it, like a proto-city. And the inclination is exactly such that if you stand in the center of the square, this becomes a new plane, a new horizon. Useful. You see the front towards the square. Here's the doors going out to the square. Here's the entrance, the main entrance. Plans are notoriously hard to read. We've been accused of it many times. So still, this is that combination of experimental music theater and the classical music theater and the connectivity. That's basically the whole project is like this. There's one threshold. This is public, and this is machinery, non-public, and this is the lobby. Here. It's incredibly hard to read. We do intend to make models for the book, but because this is actually one wide open space, yeah, you get access to that auditorium from here. Now what you show here is two main things. One is a ramp that slowly goes down underneath the stone, underneath this void here, and reaching the entrance of the musical theater, which sits here. There's access to the musical theater, and this is then that strange thing that's used once a year for an urban festival. One entrance is here, one entrance is there, and then the staircases. The restaurant sits along the glass thing, glass facade here. And here are all kinds of other functions that are cut by this glass facade. So you see almost everything from the operas is spread out along this long facade here. This is delivery and so on. The rest is as it is. This is the detail of this ramp going down underneath this sloping auditorium. It goes back down again and slopes back. This is the main lobby floor. It's a slightly curved plane that sits underneath this ramp. And the actual level of the basement is here. So this is where the ramp slowly reaches the basement level. But it's still the void of the lobby here. Higher up, you see more clearly the void of the lobby. The stone inserted cafe and restaurant along the glass wall. Big facilities and this threshold here. This is a kind of restaurant set in higher. This is then above that on top. Diagram of where the roof comes in and the striation. More models, steel this time. We have a steel workshop in the building. We have a little factory building here in London. We have a steel workshop in it, so more and more we're making steel models. You see that cave, that's the entrance, below which is the entrance to the experimental musical theatre. Side view, this is side entrance. That's just a square with other activities on it. It's a game. Okay, one last step is Buenos Aires. Very quiet building, maybe too quiet in a way, but we were really fascinated now with this liminal body notion. We tried to create, this is the last thing I show. I have a small, tiny plastic project at the end. We tried to create a project where we used one element of the program. The program was a museum for the art collection of this man, Constantini, and one element of the program was a contemporary art gallery. So we tried to use this gallery for the contemporary arts that was changing to stir the city. In other words, to create the possibility to make this square. I don't have side shots, unfortunately, here. Basically, this is a square, an area in the city. There's buildings around here, and this is the site. We tried to activate the square. That was our main desire, to activate this square so that it becomes a kind of a very alive center for this whole area, the city area, which has a lot of cultural institutions as well, which kind of we felt, like in the Prado, we felt we wanted to stir overall. So we started by laying two kind of lines, two cuts. One organizes the square, this one here. The other one organizes the building. In front of that organizer sits this object, which you could call the main liminal body, which kind of has the main public facilities of the museum. Behind it sits the contemporary art gallery on the level of a sunken square, and behind it floats very serenely the block with the fixed collection, very quietly. So the kind of four quadrants made by these cuts, they're really literally like knives. And I'll show you how the organization works of this building. Here the sketch model, one cut is literally a wall, and the other one is a wall that will go up and becomes the core of the building. And this is sunken into the ground, this part. So it's like a slow amphitheater. And here we kind of dug this liminal body into the ground. It's a long glass box, effectively, which has all the public facilities in it. And it looks at the square. And it kind of has a very strange relationship with this public art gallery that sits underneath it, which kind of feeds through or underneath it. It's a semi-threshold condition. And then the block with the permanent art collection above it. So what was very important for us was this threshold again, this kind of strange glass box, this liminal body, and the temporary exhibition area, somehow activating that square. So we call that glass box the city room. And then you have the galleries, and the city room hopefully having this echo. We really wanted to tell this man, look, you don't just build a museum, have ambitions to stir the city. So this is the final project. You see the block, the city room, the square, there's the wall along and running through it. So you come along, this is the big movement going through the site. You can actually move through the building. and the cave. Cave is a very big feature. Again, it's one of those caves giving light to the building. Actually, the bottom of it feeds light to the lobby, which is very thin, flat space, bringing the city space inside it. And view from at night from somewhere away. Again, the cave facing the city square. The city room coming out of the ground, the auditorium, at the moment there's a lecture going on at night. There's light coming out of the auditorium, sitting here. Then the bottom of the city room climbs up, becomes cafe here, and there's suspended objects in it which are offices. There's one block here is offices, and this block is the restaurant kitchen feeding the cafe here. And there's a bookshop on top of that. And this is the structure holding up. Basic section. This is the city room cut at one place. It sort of rises up slowly. In this case, it has met the lobby floor. And this is where it goes through. The cave. And this kind of this sheer action organizing the whole building. Axiomatic is the main elements. Here you see the two cuts. We're going to look at this wall now. And this wall is actually the main circulation space of the building. And this is what we call the city floor, effectively, which is contemporary art gallery and public square flowing into one body, opening up into one thing, underneath the city room, which rises up above it. Lobby plan, this is where either you come in this way, or you come in this way from the street, and you enter into this glass facade here. Flat lobby, lit by this oculus of the cave, right here, which marks the entrance of the big square. Stairs going up. These stairs going up underneath the cave, which is in fact, of course, stone inside. Big sheer wall, and the little body, in fact, the city room, this auditorium down here, and here these various other spaces that are suspended in it. In fact, they are suspended on the structure. Lower part, this auditorium, divided into 3 parts, like that. So you can walk down the glass wall here. I won't explain you really how it works, but it's beautiful because this one sheer wall organizes all the security problems of this museum, because they wanted all kinds of different access and openings at night and all that, and partial opening of the building. And all of that is done by simply locking or opening doors along this wall, in one wall. One big staircase going down, starting at the bottom of, below the cave, which is experienced as a stone, and rising up and touching every floor eventually. Every floor is different in its light and its organization. And of course the cave actually organizes that floor very strongly. So here you see it's actually very simple. You see how every floor is organized in a different way, gets light in a different way. And here you see the main staircase going up, getting light down from there. So if you go down, you look at the stone here, and there's a parallel staircase going right below it. And here you see the main section of the city room. It's auditorium and the suspended boxes in there. And the last few slides are simple attempts to show some of these activities. I think we have to redo this thing. This is the Shell Festival. Market. This part, of course, is higher, so you can, from here you can look down into what's going on here. And a few slides of a very private object that now belongs to the city of Amsterdam. They commissioned it. And this is the end of my lecture, but I shall show you these slides because somehow it related to Buenos Aires, but Buenos Aires is not yet quite so maybe alive. It just had something to do with finding out. Well, it's called the Library of the Senses. It's a strange project. They invited artists and architects within one given volume to do something about the way things are sensed in the city. So I worked with the water horizon. It's a kind of proto-architecture, the shadows of architecture, and a kind of an unconscious of the city, and that's where the caves came from. That's the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any questions?
Iftar. Yeah.
Let people get settled.
Iftar. Any?
Maybe we could take a few questions before people start rummaging around a bit too much.
Can also leave it.
No, can I?
Yes, sure. It was hard to start.
I mean, I'm thinking a bit about the things that are holding together both this kind of recurring topic of dynamic modeling that you're interested in the cities, and certain qualities that the projects seem to have. And I think there is a kind of formlessness, what people today are calling a kind of formless quality to the project, including, for example, like the method of the bean tossing itself. That there is a kind of non-structured, non-rule-based description that generates a way to go out and get research on the city. That seems to be a different sort of thing. One of the things that comes up when you talk about the cities that you're working in that's interesting is that you present the cities, the way you describe the cities that you're working in, it's as if there's a kind of primary structure. You talk about, for example, in Bucharest, the kind of massive cut through the city that becomes a major sort of organizational property. In Kyoto, the same sort of thing, in talking about the pattern of its development, and some of the other cities, in which suddenly cities seem to have a kind of primary structure or form. It's different than the kind of quality you're talking about, both in the method and this idea of a kind of dynamic process. And I'm wondering if it's because you want that to be a kind of play off the two, or if there's a way in which the method especially is trying to kind of contradict that reading of the work.
Sure. No, it's slightly different. The larger forms that appear sometimes are simply big shapes. They are, rivers, mountains, things that dictators did to cities. They're just big things that are useful, and architects and planners can use them because everybody can see them.
Like a ready-made, almost like.
They're ready-made. They're big ready-mades. They're like the small ready-mades. You have also big ready-mades. There's no difference, but they're useful because everybody knows them. You can see them. You can give them a name. They're symbolic, and they're powerful. And you need that power because you can say, look there, and you can use that power to make something else that's less powerful happen. So in Bucharest, the only reason I show slides of big things is because big rivers, are big emotional conditions. I didn't talk about it actually, but they're big emotional issues, and you can get a lot of people, a lot of different parties very quickly related to that, even if they would never talk to each other. So there's no primary form, they're just useful objects, that's all. But, and the difference is that I would say if you want to talk about form, the only form that we're working with is the form of the dynamic patterning. In other words, the structure of a scenario, in other words, the mechanics of the dynamics, that's what we're trying to find out with these processes, the mechanics of a dynamic environment, that's the form we're working with. That's the only form, I would say. Everything else is this object, common object, what I didn't mention was before was that but I kind of indirectly mentioned it, is that one of the metaphors we are working with is that the city has emotions. In other words, these proto-urban conditions are somewhat like emotions in a human being. And therefore, city has emotional behavior, and the beans throwing method, in a way, is trying to find out how you can trigger, kind of tease out these emotions. Because they're very much irrational conditions. In cities like Taichung and Taiwan, they're very irrational conditions that actually form and shape the city. It's very difficult to find any rationale there. And it's almost only possible by using these very crude big common objects like rivers and other things and markets to kind of get enough people to agree on something and to actually say, look, yes, we'll do that, and then get the politicians in because they need to be voted and so on, and then actually set a program. So it is, yeah, it's about teasing out that those underlying what we call emotive conditions, but it's really just about behavior of the city.
The actors that you find, how do you determine how do you determine these are the future actors, and how do they become authorities? And the second thing that I wanted to ask you was about the storytelling that you said that you use as a tool to develop.
Okay, the first one is my first answer would be I don't know, but I'm interested to find out. About the actors, right? The Kyoto is a very speculative project. We kind of speculated that there are. You kind of have to deal with new authorities. These environments, they're kind of ossified. Municipality with the decision-making authorities, and people are kind of making decisions for certain kind of things. But the kind of sprawl and a certain kind of decline that's going on in a situation like that, in a way, asks for new patterns of decision-making and new authorities. So we're simply curious about what these new, you could say, configurations of authorities will be like. And we're not actually saying they are like that, but we're saying only in that project you should find out. Let's tease them out, and let's see if you can have very weak emerging authorities and institutions that perhaps will have a big role to play later on, like these girls. I mean, the locker girls. We don't know. It's very speculative, that project, but it's kind of it's talking about the landscape of decision making. Who makes policies in 100 years, and how can you now begin to speculate about kind of some weak factors that actually then will emerge? But it also has to do with this shifting practice of common object. That certain things have a slow life, other things have a fast life. So infrastructure slowly changes, but the practice around the infrastructure can change very quickly. That means also maybe an authority around that practice can change very quickly. So, but I think it's very wonderful also in urban architecture to play with the notion that you can actually orchestrate urban actors and orchestrate bringing them together. And one of the things we've found in other projects is that it's really wonderful sometimes to have also something that we call angels, which are passive urban actors. And that only you can see them and the role they can play. And you kind of, in a way, tease a program out of them. And then you link that program with somebody else who kind of would need that program, effectively. It's very much about combination of actors. The second question, storytelling. Well, it has to do with scenarios. Scenarios are can be very technocratic, very difficult. But storytelling has to do with making things simple, making them sound seductive, persuade people, convince people, touch emotional conditions. In urban planning, you deal a lot with politics. And politicians are voted in by people in most places. Now, voting happens very much on well, it happens in very different ways. I'll give you one example. In Rotterdam recently, there was a big referendum about a project. The government wanted to turn Rotterdam and the surroundings into a city province. The authorities worked on it for many, many years, and they had the plan ready, and it was going to be very efficient, new infrastructures, administration, more cheap, and a big thing that's a new type of province with 27 part cities. So the population voted in the referendum, but because they felt emotionally their city, the city of Rotterdam, these were the people that voted, their city was going to be cut up, because their city was going to be actually compartmentalized in 5 out of these 27 new cities. So they said, look, we're going to lose our city. It's going to be cut up. Culture is going to be fragmented. There's no city center left. And the whole debate was like that. One level, the planners saying, actually, I think a very interesting project, very interesting plan. It's really opened new possibilities for urban planning and design. The majority of the population, of those that voted, actually, 80% of the 42% that voted said no. Just purely emotional levels. I say, fantastic, beautiful example. Now the whole thing is down, and now, of course, eventually the government will probably get its way in a simpler way. So I believe that we, as architects, we try to do that with the Berlage Institute. We could have actually made a difference by telling stories about new types of public space that very much related through fieldwork to the local actors and agents and institutions, and that would necessitate such urban change. It would necessitate this administrative and political reorganization. We didn't manage. I think we were not courageous enough. I regret it. I wish we had gone public with the project. But there, I think, yes, there you need to tell a story. You have to put a scenario into a story, because a story can touch on things that are very simple and quick to understand by a lot of people. But actually it has an unfolding. So I think more and more dynamic scenarios in urban planning have to be told as a story. And, because you have to bring, because often there's no forum in which to bring the different parties together that actually could make a difference. Hope it answers your question. Yeah.
I'm not sure you're right. I mean, that's the authorities are classified, as you said, because after all, it is
not the way. Yeah, they're not
very authorities which are actually responsible for the dynamics, in part responsible for the dynamics which are below the horizon. And my question is, well, one of the essential aspects of this dynamic is something to do with reason. And is reason being one of the key elements in the functioning of democracy. And so my question is about the relationship between, on the one hand, those marvelous things which you have described to do with emotion and poetry and chance and plasticity, and on the other hand, these mechanics which I think are, to a large extent, rational, which actually are responsible to make the city what it is.
hold on. The question is that there are certain mechanics that are.
All right, very simply, the question is, how can one bring together what is the legitimate area of the desire to do with, in your term, emotion, poetics, and plasticity and chance, to mention just 4 terms, and on the other hand, the processes which actually make a city, which are to some extent informed by reason. So on the one hand, there are things which have to do with emotions and sensitivity.
Sure.
As well as desire. On the other, there is an essential rational aspect to making a city.
Sure. I think that's fine, but I think what you would have to prove is that there's a deficiency, that those rational processes that you mentioned are not enough, that they cannot deal with maybe new complex conditions, new forms of productivity, new forms of information exchange, new form of cultural identity. They simply cannot deal with all those aspects. You would have to prove that. I would have to prove that. I would have to prove that those existing mechanisms of decision making, policy making, and so on, couldn't handle certain newly emerging forms of our society. That would, I guess, is the basic premise, of course. Like a master plan is not any for a very useful tool for urban planning, as a very simple statement. I think those mechanics of urban planning can be outdated, like a car can be outdated, and I think you would have to prove that. But I believe there's a very delicate balance between the rationality of democracy and the mechanics of all the urban processes, of course, which partly are very precisely organized, market-oriented or whatever, and yet they relate very closely to, under the surface, to things that are absolutely intuitive, absolutely irrational. We just had a big meeting with in the Westerberlage in Maastricht, with the biggest investor in Holland, the man who commissions all the housing, all the Sporenburg, West 8, and so on and so forth. We asked him, how do you decide? And he makes the map of architecture to a large extent. How do you decide? How do you choose? It was incredible. I mean, he was like a man full of enthusiasm. Yes, of course, there's profit and loss and all that. And ultimately, he started to talk about how he started to choose cities in which he would implant his investments and trigger things, and then we know. And it was wonderful. He said, well, ultimately, everything comes down to the blue eyes. I said, well, blue eyes? What do you mean? He said, if you like somebody or not. We work with the city if we like personally to work together with the chief decision makers in that. It was actually incredible, that the process is boiled down to such basic and totally unmeasurable conditions. And he says, if this doesn't click, forget it. We're out. We're just not even considering it. and it was incredible. Of course, then there were a lot of discussions about exact mechanics of investment and profit making, and why quality actually pays off over the longer time terms, which he stated quality does pay off, he said. And he spelled it out very precisely in financial terms. But this kind of intuitive thing, I think we should not underestimate. I think they're powerful things that are as strong as the rational mechanisms that are put in place by democratic institutions and others. So I don't want to put the balance on that, on the emotional metaphor and all that. It's an important metaphor only if you assume that there's other institutions and their practices are in place, but perhaps deficient, not sufficient, I think. So in Kyoto, I'm not criticizing the authorities. I'm more saying that, well, the way they're organized, the way they gather information, the way they see what's going on, I think is not good enough anymore. It's deficient. And so I think they need to have new tools of observation, and those tools may well turn to a different organization of authority landscape. But this is pure speculation at the moment. I hope that it's a difficult issue, and I certainly don't have very precise answers to that. But any last one? Right?
One of your initial conclusions would be an insightful statement on the political mechanisms and the project. You said the project forms the sort of political context. I'm paraphrasing to some extent.
Yes.
I would say that the mechanisms of urbanism would be the inversion of that, in that the political mechanisms are then set up to produce what would be more understood as the architectural project. Kind of simplifying the scales of
Sure.
architecture and urbanism. But within the projects that you've shown, given that many have been competitions that are
Sure.
urban and architectural, whether complete, very different in scales from a 4,000 square meter cultural museum to that of dealing with large regions.
Sure, very.
One can make that assumption. But the question concerns the degree of completeness and how one measures and how one can judge, even if on a scale of urbanism, whether completeness is a motivation or pursuit or an ambition or even a possibility, and how that confronts, as you talked about, a kind of distancing posturing to that of urban planning.
Yeah.
And what is completeness to an urban project relative to that? As we would probably have a shared understanding is what a completed architectural project is.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thing, and I'm almost frustrated in these building projects. It's in a way you have to finish it. You have to make something